When I think about legacy, these are the kinds of questions I ask. One is, what are my children actually going to say about me? All right? Really, if I can get into my child's head, what is my Gabriella going to say about me? What is my Talia going to say about me? And they're basically going to look at a very few areas in their life. One, they're going to look at that I love them unconditionally. Was I really there for them? Did I make the time for them? Did I have experiences with them? Are there memories that they have that were fun and loving, and that also memories that made claims on them and claims about what they should be in the world? So that's the very first thing that I think about when I think about legacy. The next thing I think about in legacy is, did I use my talents actually beyond my own family? Did I stretch? Did I cross any boundaries? Did I cross any borders? Did I do things with my own talent that ensured that I would also fail, for example? Or did I take the safe route really all the way through my life? And then what were the people who I interacted with in my business, in my social, what are they going to say about me? Was I a loyal friend? Or was I, fly by night? Did I teach my wisdom in a pandering way, or did I teach my wisdom in a stretching way? And finally, how did I use my talents? When I look in the mirror at the end of my life, did I stretch myself, or did I not stretch myself? Did I take the easy way out, or did I not take the easy way out?
There's an unusual passage in the Talmud in which the rabbis speculate on what are the first questions the heavenly court asks us after we die and appear before it. And I like to study this passage with people, and I'll ask them, what do you think the rabbis would think of the first questions we're asked? And people traditionally say, did you believe in God? Or did you keep the Sabbath? Or maybe did you fast on Yom Kippur? And they're taken aback to learn that the first question is, Nasata v'natata b'emunah. Did you carry out your business affairs honestly? The first proof of whether you've lived a religious life is not how you act towards God, but how what you've learned about God influences how you act towards other people. And so the proof text becomes that. And it's interesting that they thought this already 2,000 years ago, that that's what they should do.
The Hasidim say the most difficult part of that judgment is that we are shown a movie, fast forward, of our entire lives. And it's not so much God who judges it, but we ourselves judge our lives. And seeing some moments makes us squirm, seeing some moments makes us embarrassed, and seeing others makes us proud.
I don't think that it's coincidental that Judaism spends much more time talking about what happens in this world and what should happen in this world, because we don't want to become so focused on what happens after we die that we don't spend any time trying to make this world better, that we don't spend time repairing our relationships in this world. And so we can't know what happens after we're gone. I think, though, that we might think about what legacy we want to leave for our children and for our grandchildren, and how we want to be remembered in our own community.
There's a beautiful teaching of that you have to treat each day as the last day of your life, actually. And of course, that's both incredibly energizing and incredibly paralyzing. Because if I really was going to die tomorrow, it would be completely overwhelming, because I am attached to this life, and I'm attached to the people that I love, and I'm attached to the dreams that I've had, and I'm attached to a whole set of things. On the other hand, it is also energizing, because it turns out that the thing that we control least is our time. And when time becomes scarce, we treat each moment more preciously. Decision-making is one of those things that 99% of our decisions we make habitually. So the interesting thing, actually, if you want to become good at decision-making, is dehabituate yourself from the decisions that are actually the ones that you make automatically. So you know how it is, you decide to take the exact same path to work every single day. The same car route or the same train. What's really interesting is make a different decision. Because in the making a different decision, you'll feel a little anxiety. And then you'll be more prepared for the anxiety that comes from the decisions that are so big that you have no practice in making them. So the first thing to understand about decision making is that we make many, many, many more decisions than we agonize about. We make many decisions that we don't even think about. It's good to begin thinking about some of the decisions we don't think about, and that prepares us for the major decisions.
Every aspect of your life requires decision making. What are the most important areas? What do you want to do with your life? Who do you want to marry? How is it that so many people mess up that decision, that more than 50% of marriages end in divorce? It means that they didn't think it through properly, or they made a mistake. Now, what am I going to do for a living? For a living, you should ask, what do I want to do for a life? Not what I want to do for a living. What do you want your life to be? Today, when you say, who are you? They identify themselves by their job. Why don't you identify yourself with what you want to do as a person to leave over when you're finished? They don't put shoemaker or banker on a tombstone. They put beloved this or beloved that. The memories that you accumulate in the minds of others are reflections of what you have achieved. And therefore, what you've said is so important. Decision making requires that people not fall into a career, not fall into a marriage because they just happened to meet a girl or a guy and all of a sudden there was a moment of passion. Every part of life requires decision making. Decision making is a process, and it requires rationality. Take a piece of paper and say pro and say con. Don't simply fall into things, because falling into things is by definition a descent, and you want to rise in life.
When I think about crowds and about groupthink, I think about this very small section of Talmud. It's in a tractate called Horayot. It's a very short tractate, and the issue that it deals with in one place is the question of what happens when the Beit Din, when the court of law, makes the wrong decision, and people start to follow that wrong decision. And one of the rulings there says that if there's a situation where the decision is wrong, people are doing something that's actually forbidden, people who don't know that they're doing something wrong aren't held responsible for their decision. The Beit Din is certainly held responsible. The people who are making the laws are held responsible. But if there's a situation where somebody knows that the court has made the wrong decision, then that person is held responsible if he or she follows the court's decision knowing that it's wrong, which I think is very important in our world, in the modern world, where we've realized in the 20th century, certainly, and in the 21st century, the importance of bystanders. We know that many people will say, well, I was just following orders. I was just doing what I was told. I was just doing what everybody else was doing. And we know how dangerous it is when there are some people who just follow orders. And we also have made a decision in general as a community not to excuse people for just following orders. And so on the one hand, we can say that we have a community that does have communal standards, it holds ourselves to a certain norm, and yet we also have expectations that individuals will make ethical decisions within that framework.
Most important decision you have to make is decisions that represent you and your life. Money is an additional aspect of your life. Money is paper until you do something with it. What you do with the money is the decision that people don't even think about when they dedicate their lives to making money. It is fascinating that I spoke to MBA students at Drew University, and I asked them, if I were to give you $50 million, what would you do with it? And someone raised their hand, he says, I would invest it. And I said, that's interesting. So all you're telling me that you would do with it is try to make more. What if I gave you $500 million? Well, I'd invest it too. But what do you want to bottom line do with it? And so I'm saying, you have to ultimately think of what you want to accomplish with your life rather than accumulate.
The anxiety of those major decisions I call sacred anxiety. The very first thing one needs to do when one has the anxiety about major decisions is take a deep breath and say, wow, this is a burning bush moment for me. I have a decision to make. This decision, for whatever reason, I think is going to make a major difference in my life. Usually those decisions revolve around just a few things. Usually they have to do with making a deep commitment to somebody in one's life. In other words, a marriage or having children, a decision that's going to have some long-term impact, or a decision about career or where one's going to live. And of course those decisions are going to create anxiety, because we're human beings who like to avoid at all costs any kind of destabilization and change. But the thing is, just remember, the only way to avoid all destabilization and all change is to be dead. Turns out if you're dead, there's no change. There's no destabilization. You're in a perfect fixed state. So the very fact that one feels anxiety at major decision-making moments means you're alive. And I find that right away when that happens, I go, oh yeah, right. This is what it means to be human, to feel this anxiety, rather than to be repelled by the anxiety, rather than to be freaked out by the anxiety. I may want to turn away like Moses does at the burning bush, but then I want to turn into the decision itself and understand this is an invitation. This is an invitation to grow and develop. We tend to think in America that a major decision has to be made all on my own. Right? There are no self-made people. Right? No such thing as self-made people. So find yourself a friend and acquire a teacher, and then trust yourself. We're living in one of the greatest periods of uncertainty. At least that's the way we tell the story. I always say when Adam and Eve were leaving the Garden of Eden, Adam turned to Eve and said, honey, we're living in a moment of transition. So we always are living in moments of transition. Sometimes it seems more blatant and overt in our consciousness. The key to living uncertainty is very simple. I mean, it's very hard and very simple. And that is to understand that uncertainty is always a prelude to certainty. That you simply cannot have uncertainty if you haven't experienced certainty. And so, again, life is a dance between uncertainty and certainty. And we know from our own lives that the periods of uncertainty have always led to growth, have always led to development, though of course they're painful. And there's always loss in moments of uncertainty, because uncertainty is making a claim that, you know, the certainty that you had before this period? There was something illusionary about it. There was something about that certainty that wasn't as certain as you think.
I think it's very easy to go through life just being pessimistic, because if we open up the newspaper, it's mostly bad news. If we listen to what's going on in the world, if we look at our own bank accounts, it feels like it's mostly bad news, especially right now. But we have a choice of either being pessimistic, which I think is a very difficult way to go through life, or looking for the possibility that the world could be better. And we can choose to go one way or the other. And for me, it's much easier to choose to be an optimist, to think about how far we've come. Even just in the past 30, 40, 50 years, I think about where we were as a country before the civil rights era. I think about where we were before certain social programs went into effect. And I think that we have the possibility right now of reimagining what we want both our country and our world to look like, and to start to create that, and to know that it's not going to be done by the time any of us finish our work here. It just won't. And yet we have to feel like we're moving towards something. Otherwise, it's hard to get up in the morning if you don't feel like there's something that you're working toward that will be better than what's been.
Pessimism and optimism are simply two aspects, normal aspects of the human experience. Pessimism is when I've probably lost a bit too much hope. Optimism is probably a moment in which I have a little bit too much hope. Now, it turns out it feels better to have a little too much hope. But here's the truth about optimism. 100% absolute, clear truth about optimism. An optimistic person will at some point feel pessimistic. Because if you have too much hope, your hope is going to be dashed at least a little bit.
To be a believer must mean to be an optimist. Otherwise, one is saying this world is out of control, this world is meaningless, there is no guide. You know that the word God is actually a contraction of the word good? To believe in God is to believe that there is some plan, that there is some purpose. And therefore, be a pessimist to the extent that you don't fool yourself into thinking that everything will work out all right. Not everything will work out all right. Be a pessimist sufficiently to warn you of dangers implicit in things that are too risky, implicit in things that you shouldn't be doing. Be a pessimist to say, maybe it won't work out. But be an optimist to say, but I'm here for a good reason, and there is a good God, and bottom line, life makes sense, and I'm going to help it make sense.
It's true that in our world things happen very, very fast, both in the world of business, in the world of politics. It's very difficult to keep track of all of the information that's out there that might have an effect on us or might have an effect on the greater world. I think that we can look to Judaism for comfort in a number of ways. First of all, Jewish history gives us a sense of being part of something that goes back for thousands of years. And so even though we feel like our world is moving incredibly fast, and even though we feel like everything's urgent, it's helpful to look back and to say, well, we're actually part of a bigger picture, and to think about where we want to be in that bigger picture. And then second, Jewish practice also gives us many tools for finding peace and calm. We have the tools of prayer, which allow us to look inward as well as to be part of a community. Jewish practice pushes us to be part of a community of people who can support us no matter what's going on in our worlds, in our lives, in their lives. And of course, we can also think about our relationship with God, especially at times like this. And it's a time that sometimes when we don't know what else to do, that we can just offer our pure emotions to God or look for support from God, however we might define God.
One of the ways in which one can maintain a kind of predisposition to hope, whether we call that optimism, whether we call that hopefulness, whether we call that happiness, one of the ways to do that is to always be asking two different sorts of questions. One set of questions is, am I actually satisfying needs along the continuum of what it means to be a human being? Am I actually satisfying material needs, emotional, psychological, love needs, intellectual needs to grow, and spiritual needs? Because very often what we do is one set of needs crowds out another set of needs, and we wind up feeling, therefore, unsatisfied. But the dissatisfaction is coming from not giving attention to the full range of needs that need to be satisfied as human beings, the full parts of who we are that need to be developed. Not only our material, physical parts, but again, our emotional, psychological parts, our intellectual, cognitive parts, and our spiritual soul parts. So if one is feeling pessimistic, if one is feeling unhappy, chances are one set of needs is crowding out another set of needs. Now, that's not so easy to ask. That's the process of introspection. Sadness, pessimism, disappointment, frustration, which takes away from our happiness, as an invitation to grow and develop, to learn about deeper forms of happiness. Pessimism, unhappiness, disappointment is an invitation to recalibrate I want it all, I'm happy with exactly what I have. Sometimes I want it all makes you dissatisfied with now, so you feel unhappy. Sometimes I have everything I want right now winds up stultifying us, compromising us, limiting what it is we really can do and create, how much we can love. And therefore we wind up feeling inside, unconscious first, a kind of, or subconscious first, a kind of unhappiness. So if you want the key to happiness, the key to optimism, the key to hopefulness, address the full continuum of your needs, from the material, psychological, social, spiritual, ethical, moral, intellectual, across the board. Be developing all along the way, and hold together. I want it all, and I'm happy with exactly what I have now.
Once you give up, failure will always then end up succeeding. That's why it's such an advantage to be in life an optimist and not a pessimist, because the only people who end up accomplishing anything are the optimists, because the pessimists have given up in advance. Once you become aware of all the reasons why something is not going to succeed, you will not make the effort anymore because you don't think it will help. So optimism is the precursor for an improvement of the world. And the rabbis actually tell us virtually as a command, did you hope for the world's redemption? Because guess what? You can't pass the test of being a good person and improving the world if you've given up on the possibility of the world's redemption, because improvement depends on having that hope.
material loss is one of the most destabilizing and undermining occurrences in our lives. And it's very simple why that is. It's because we live on multiple levels, right? Whether you call it spiritual different levels or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it turns out that the material really is good. The question is, good for what? So when we experience a material loss, it's very, very important to ask specific questions. What exactly have I lost? What of the material is absolutely necessary? And what is it that became a luxury that turned into a necessity?
One thing people hate is if you just give a pat answer. And I'm not someone who believes in that. I don't think that the response is, oh, don't worry, everything will be better, everything will be fine. That's Pollyannish. That's almost foolish. What you have to do initially, the first step is to acknowledge. We can't live in denial, and to acknowledge that we are living in extremely serious times, financially and otherwise, is to recognize reality. We have an obligation to open our eyes and recognize reality.
Material loss has never been minimized in the Jewish tradition. There have been other religious traditions that have, in fact, painted a somewhat idealized version of poverty, and understandably so. If people could really divest themselves of material concerns, they would seem to be freer to lead more spiritual lives. That really, though, hasn't been the case in Jewish teachings. Obviously, there have been Jews who have been ascetics, but mainstream Jewish teachings have never glorified asceticism, nor has it been glorified in the Jewish community. As I've often had occasion to comment, in no society in which Jews have lived have we ever been confused with the Amish. Jews have generally tended to be a materially ambitious group, and part of it was a very realistic rabbinic assessment on this subject, where the rabbis actually teach in the Midrash that the worst sufferings that can befall a person, and I'm assuming they mean outside of, God forbid, the loss of children and terrible deaths like that, but the worst suffering that can befall a person is poverty. Say the average person would prefer to endure almost anything but poverty. In the prayers that we recite after eating a meal, what's called the Birkat HaMazon, the grace after eating, we speak of the fact that we don't want to ever be in a situation where we're dependent on the gifts of others.
We're at a moment when virtually everybody, no matter what economic level we're at, is having to cut back, either in small ways or in big ways. And it's very natural to need to mourn for that loss. And I think that we should understand that people are mourning for the loss. I think that we should take some time ourselves to mourn for that loss. And I think that as a community, we have a tradition of taking responsibility for other people in our community, both economically and also spiritually. And so this is a moment for us as a community to step up and to say that we're going to care for the people in our community who are really suffering, whether they're suffering spiritually, whether they're suffering economically, whether they're suffering in both ways. And that even though we might be suffering ourselves to some degree, that we need to step up. We need to offer as much money as we can, as much material support as we can, as well as much listening support and as much spiritual support as we can to try to help people in our community and outside of our community as well to get through these times with our own senses of selves intact.
The one thing that can never be taken away from a person are the acts of charity that he or she has already done, which is why I think we can assume that many of the wealthy people who later on lose their money, the one thing that they don't regret is the good things that they did earlier, because the good act that we've done can never be taken from us. Money can be. We've learned that in the stock market they always speak of what are called paper profits, and we all have had the experience of owning a stock and thinking at a certain point that we were quite wealthy, and then finding that the company collapsed. And in the case of fraud, it turns out we never even owned what we thought we had in the first place. But the good that we've done, that remains our eternal possession. So I'm not trying in any way to minimize fiscal losses. I know that in my own life there are a few things that have the capacity to make me as nervous as the fact of the loss of money and the loss of income and the concern about it. And I know that I know that I wish I had more trust that things are happening as they are meant to happen. And I therefore try and be very careful. I'm not trying to in any way diminish the significance of these events, but what I am saying is the wonderful consolation is that there is a possession that's permanent, and that is not money. That possession are the good deeds that we've done for others.
Because material wealth and material goods are so intoxicating, and they actually, it's like almost like a drug, right? A drug gives a great initial high, but one can become intoxicated to that high, and it's a quicker, higher high very often than emotional goods, spiritual goods, and therefore can easily become dependent and crowd out the other types of gains we need. Gains in our spiritual life, gains in our intellectual life, gains in our psychological life. So turns out that material loss is an incredible opportunity to do a inventory on the full portfolio of gains and losses that one has in their lives. Now, of course, when material loss is such that one doesn't have shelter, one doesn't have food, one doesn't have clothing, now we're talking about a devastating loss in which what a person has to do is be willing to be vulnerable and put themselves out to their family, to their community, and ask for help. But most of the material loss, we see it, for example, in a period of an economic downturn. The vast majority of the people in the country, what they have lost is not that which they need, but that which became necessary as a part of an illusion to protect against psychological and spiritual development.
Remember Jack Benny, your money or your life? When the robber said to him, your money or your life, the big laugh was that his response was, I'm thinking. And we look at that and we say, how stupid. What do you mean you're thinking? The guy said, your money or your life. It's obvious what the correct answer is. And there are people who still don't understand the correct answer. What I'm saying is a time of difficulty requires that we reorient ourselves, and maybe, just maybe, that's one of its purposes.
God is just a code word, okay? God is a code word for experiences and emotions and feelings that are very, very intense. It doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It means that anything we say about God is in the end our projection. So, for example, when do we say, oh God, we could be making love. And in the moment of climax, we say, oh God. But you know, the World Trade Center can come down. We can hear about a great tragedy and we say, oh my God. So that's a funny thing. We use God when we're having a moment of lovemaking and unity and it's amazing. And we use the word God when there is a great tragedy that's so overwhelming. But then someone sneezes and we say, God bless you. You know, so God, it turns out, is just a code word. You know, a child is born and we say, oh my God. And then we wind up naming God the Creator. You know, God the Destroyer, God the Redeemer, God the Revealer, God of salvation. These are all aspects that human beings discover in reality. But it turns out we have this need to put those aspects into a you, into a thou, and put that thou into the universe so that we can actually relate to the very aspects and qualities of the universe and of reality that we have discovered. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a God, but it just means anything we say about God is from the human perspective.
You don't pray because you believe God is a cosmic bellhop who you're going to call upon to give you whatever you want, and then get angry if he didn't, because you snapped your fingers, bring you just what you ordered. That's not the way God runs the world. But God says, I want you to understand that you and I can have a relationship. And the way in which we express our understanding of that idea is by praying.
I think that we often think about God as someone, as a being who can give us things. We ask God for specific material support. We ask God for good grades, or we ask God for a new job or a promotion or success or good health. We often think of God in that way. And that often leads us to disappointment, because God isn't a Santa Claus who goes around giving out treats to everybody. And instead, I think that it's much more helpful to think of God as both a source of support and also as a push toward engagement in the world. In Judaism, we think about prayer as both a way for us to reflect ourselves, and so prayer is a moment for us to think about what we need, to examine ourselves, to become more aware of who we are, and to find spiritual fulfillment, to find the sense of strength that comes from prayer, and specifically from praying within a community. And that sense of strength can help us often get through uncertain times. Sometimes when we don't know what else to do, we can just pray either by ourselves or in our community and find the emotional strength to go on from that. But prayer and our relationship with God also pushes us outward. The idea is that one of our tasks in the world is to be like God as much as possible. And so when we pray, when we come into relationship with God, that relationship should force us to say to ourselves, well, how am I working to clothe the naked? How am I working for justice? What can I do to feel like I'm doing something of use in the world, which will give me some spiritual satisfaction, but also to help other people get through this uncertain time?
When I speak to God, I know that He is listening. That's what I say in my prayers. Blessed are you, O Lord, who hears prayer. And that's all I need. I just need God to listen to me. If I know that God hears, I know that if He doesn't answer the way I want the answer to be, He feels that the answer He has given me is His divine response. Prayer is communicating with God and knowing that you're not talking to yourself, knowing that there is a greater power out there. After I pray, I have achieved something, whether God answered my prayers or not, because I become a better person in being someone who acknowledges the reality of the relationship and acknowledges God. In that way, God has already answered the most important part of my prayer. He's made me better than I was when I started praying.
Prayer turns out to be the way in which all human beings want to communicate to that which is beyond them. Okay? There's no such human being who doesn't pray. No such human being. You may not pray from a prayer book, you may not pray from a hymnal, but there's no such thing as a person who doesn't at least sometimes call out to the universe, I want, I need, please. Those are called prayers of request. But there's also no such thing as a human being who sometimes doesn't call out to the universe, wow, that's so beautiful. That's called prayers of praise. And these are actually the categories of prayer within the Jewish wisdom tradition. Request, praise. Sometimes there isn't a human being in the world who sometimes doesn't simply call out to the cosmos, call out to the universe, call out to reality. Thank you so much. By the way, including people who don't believe in God. You know, as I always say, I don't believe in the God you don't believe in either. Right? So the issue isn't do you believe in God. The issue is, do you ever make requests of the universe? The issue isn't do you believe in God in the sky, not in the sky. Do you ever feel the urge to just say, hallelujah, oh my God, even if you don't believe in God? Do you ever have the urge to say thank you? Just for your life? Not to some God, just the urge to say thank you. And do you ever have the urge to want to be forgiven and to ask for forgiveness? And I don't only mean another person, but those four categories: the desire for forgiveness, the desire to just say thank you to the universe, the desire to just say wow, and the desire to ask for something from the universe. It turns out that that is what we mean by prayer.
The essence of wisdom is to know the difference between two statements. One is, I have failed. The other is, I am a failure. Everybody fails at various times in their lives. The question is, do you learn from that failure? Do you move on? Do you grow? And allow that failure to teach you not to make the same mistake again. Thomas Edison, after 600 failures in trying to vent the electric light bulb, somebody said to him, "You have failed 600 times." He said, "God forbid. I have succeeded 600 times in knowing that those paths don't work."
It turns out that the most important aspect of success is failure. And every single person who's ever been successful knows that. Show me a person who's never failed, and I'll show you a person who really has never been successful, or who has been successful in such a shallow and narrow way relative to their capacities and abilities that it's really no success at all. So it turns out that failure is simply a prerequisite. Failure is a prerequisite for success. You actually need failure. I don't care who you are. You could be the greatest foul shooter, the greatest basketball player. Michael Jordan will tell you how often he failed. In fact, Michael Jordan will be able to probably tell you the times in his career where he failed more accurately than he'll remember the great successes. Because anyone who is highly successful has actually used failure as the very stepping stones, as the very building blocks, as the very sources for wisdom to actually become more successful. And that's true in everything. Ask a writer how many times they've deleted, right? Or how many times they've had to crumble up that page because it just didn't work. And yet it was the hundreds and hundreds of deletions that allowed for that one paragraph that was absolutely remarkable. In our relationships, ask people, ask a person, you never failed in your relationship? If you never failed in your relationship, then your relationship is pretty shallow. The interesting thing is, what does one do with the failure?
Most of us are set up to want to be successes in our business, especially in our work, in our school, in what we produce in the world. And so when we fail, or when we're part of a business that fails, we often take it very personally, and we feel like we ourselves are failures because our business failed, because our work failed, because we lost money, because we didn't notice a trend that was coming. And this is a moment when we can really reconsider what is actually important in our world. It's a moment when we can say, well, maybe my whole personality isn't going to be defined by how much money I can make. Or maybe my whole personality won't be defined by how much I can produce at work. Instead, maybe I'll define myself and my sense of myself as a success or as a failure on other factors. Maybe I'll define my success on the relationships that I have with family and friends, on the volunteer work that I do in my own community or outside of my own community, on the extent to which I can have an impact on creating the kind of country and the kind of world where I want to live. And I think this is a moment that we can step back and we can take stock of our lives and we can say, well, what would it really take for me to be a success in my life, and start to craft our lives around that.
Success has two components. It has the component of what we call success and the component of what we call failure. And genuine success is the dance between success and failure, success and failure. So the next time you fail, what's really important to know is, okay, this is a prerequisite for success. It's coming down. If I can actually learn about this failure, I can learn about what this is. If I can actually do an analysis on this failure and not be freaked out by the failure, because without this failure, I can't have the success that's coming, we will actually be able to avoid the devastating quality very often that failure has for us.
Greatest president of the United States, I think, Abraham Lincoln, lost every election he ever ran in except for one. And that was when he became president. If he would have given up any time beforehand, we would never have had the benefit of his leadership. You are destined, if you're human, to make mistakes. For two reasons. Humans make mistakes, and more. God wants us to make mistakes in order to grow from them. I understand that now. When they're looking for CEOs in major companies, one of the questions they ask them is, have you ever failed? And they want the answer to be yes, so that they can then follow up and ask the next question, and what did you do after you failed? Because that is the ultimate question, not just in business, but the ultimate question that God asks us. What did you do after you failed? I lost money in my life. I overcame. I had difficulties in personal areas and difficulties in personal growth, but I overcame, and I'm not finished yet. And I hope to continue to overcome. And that's what every one of us should always say to ourselves. Not I failed, I'm a failure, but I failed, so what can I do with it?
And if you look at wisdom traditions, and I don't care what wisdom traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, look at the great founders and look at the moments of failure. You know, Moses fails numerous times. So we call Moses not a, we call Moses not a success. I mean, Moses failed at the most important goal he had, which was to get into the land and to get into the promised land and to get his people into his promised land. He dies before he realizes that which was the goal of his whole life. Moses a failure or a success? No, it turns out very often that the way we understand a person's success is by how big their failures can be, how noble their failures can be. If you dream small, you'll fail small. If you dream big, you will actually fail big. Who do you want to be? Who do you want to be in that game? Does Abraham never fail? Look at how he acts with his sons. Does Isaac never fail? Does Jacob never fail? Does Judah? Judah fails. I mean, Judah fails unbelievably. He sells his brother. You don't have worse failure than that in a familial life. And yet it's that failure that allows Judah to make one of the great comebacks and successful moves in all of biblical wisdom. He's willing to sacrifice his life for his younger brother Benjamin. So success and failure have to be very, very careful. You know, the Talmud teaches that a person who has failed and repented is at a higher level than a person who has never erred and never failed at all.
Do you know why Jews have a Shabbat? We have a Sabbath not for the purpose of resting because we worked hard during the week. It has absolutely nothing to do with rest. The best analogy the Midrash gives is, if you take a painter who is doing a painting, every so often he stops, steps back, and looks at it. On Shabbat, we are supposed to step back and look at our lives. We work 6 days. Let me see what I'm working for. I own a business. Maybe the business owns me. I have to reflect on that. And that's why Yom Kippur then is called the Sabbath of Sabbaths, because once a year you're supposed to take annual stock. Isn't it fascinating that every businessman knows that for the business? The business, I've got to take stock to see if I'm losing or gaining, to see if the business is doing what I want it to do. The most important business you will ever control is you. The most important business that you are head of, CEO and CFO and board, etc., is you. You are invested in yourself. And you've got to take stock of your business to see if it follows your priorities. So you take a business, take any business, and they have a mission statement. You can't have a business, including Google, that doesn't have a business statement, a mission statement. What do you want to accomplish? I've done this hundreds of times. I ask people, what is your mission statement in life? And they say, gee, I never thought of that. And I'm talking about people in their 30s and people in their 50s. What do you mean you never thought of that? But how can you run your business without a mission statement? Where are you going?
I think that in the modern world, we are set up to think that our self-worth is defined by what we do, what we produce in the world, how successful we are at our jobs, how many degrees we have, what we write, how much money we make. And this is a moment when many people are suffering at work, when many people are suffering economically, to take a step back and say, well, maybe that's not how we should define our self-worth. Maybe ourselves as human beings, we should define according to what we do here that will be remembered long after we're gone. People won't necessarily remember how much money that we made, but they will remember whether we dedicated ourselves to tzedakah, to giving money to the poor, to taking care of the poor. They'll remember whether we spent time with our friends and family in our community. People will remember whether we gave of our own time to take care of other people. And so maybe we should redefine success and failure on these terms, that our success is living up to the ideals of what a human being could be. That is, somebody who takes seriously the responsibility to create a better world. And failure would mean that we don't take that responsibility seriously at all.
The most important thing about the question of self-worth is which self? That's the single most important thing. We have a lot of different selves. We wear a lot of different hats. I have a father self, and I have a son self, and I have a brother self. I have a president of class self, and I have a teacher self, and a rabbi self, and a fundraiser self. I have an American self and a Jewish self. I have a male self. So there are a lot of different selves that I have that I wear. And it's who I am is the combination of all of those selves, and that's always dynamic and always changing. And if I have undue self-esteem, arrogance, it's because I have over-identified with oneself regarding who I am. So if I feel really great because I'm like incredibly successful in business, or I'm like, like I'm a great rabbi, and I feel really arrogant about that, and that becomes my source of self-worth, it turns out it's going to be illusionary self-worth because it's only one of my selves. It'll not deal with the full range of my selves that create self-esteem.
I wrote a book called Taking Stock, where I made a confession. I had, after I retired, tried to have some more means for my family, for the future. I invested in stocks. I made a fortune because that was a bubble, and I thought I was a genius, and obviously I wasn't. And whatever I made, I gave back, and then I had to deal with the loss of funds. And I began to review where I had gone wrong and what I learned from that experience. I have to tell you that one day it actually hit me strongest when, in the aftermath of calling my broker for the 50th time that day, my wife said to me, "Did you call him again? Why'd you call him?" And I said, "Well, I want to find out how much I'm worth." And right after the words came out of my mouth, it hit me. I wanted to find out how much I'm worth. Is that what my true worth is? I was making the ultimate mistake. I was confusing the value of my portfolio with my value as an individual. Your greatest responsibility is to achieve what you can as a human being. The Talmud puts it best when it says the following. It says that we have three friends in life that we seek to befriend and seek to be comfortable with: our money, our family, and our good name. When you die, the first thing to leave you is your money. You no longer own a thing, you're dead. Your family walks with you to the grave. They accompany you a little further, but they leave once you're interred. Your good deeds live on forever. And look at what we do. We put most of our emphasis on accumulating more money, which is going to go first, and we do not think of our family to that extent, and more significantly, we do not pursue the ideals that will remain evermore as a lasting inheritance to the world.
There's a famous text in the Talmud called Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, and it's sort of the ethical aphorisms, the favorite quotes of rabbis over a period of several hundred years. And one of the rabbis is a man named Ben Zoma, who liked to ask provocative questions and then liked to provide even more provocative answers. For example, he asked, "Who is wise?" And the answer is, "Halomed mikol adam," one who learns from everyone. So a wise person is not necessarily just one who's always teaching people, but it's one who's always open to learning. Because if you're always just trying to teach, at a certain point you're just going to be recycling your material. You're not acquiring new material. A person who's open to learning from every encounter, that's really going to become a person of great wisdom. Who is a hero? Ezu Gabor. Who is a strong person? One who can overcome his inclinations, and the rabbis seem to be referring to his evil inclinations, though it means, the struggle with ourselves, because the rabbis understood the hardest struggle in which every human being engages is with himself, and to have to learn and know what are your weaknesses and what do you have to struggle with every day, because otherwise you can go through life hurting people. A third question there, though, is who is rich? And this, I find, the answer is both provocative and probably among the hardest teachings in Judaism to absorb, and most people learn to absorb it only when it's a little too late. Who is rich? Hasameach bechelko, one who is happy with what he or she has. It is very hard for most of us to practice that teaching, because most of us have a tendency to think, if I only had this, I'd be happier. But there are so many areas in which we can be provoked to unhappiness. If my spouse was different in this regard, then I would be happy. If my children were different in this regard, or achieved this sort of success, then I'd be happy. If my income level rose by a certain amount, then I would be happy. In fact, studies have routinely found that no matter how much people are earning, except maybe in the stratospheres of tremendous wealth, but even there it probably applies, no matter how much people are earning, most people have a tendency to think that if they were earning about another 25 or 30%, then they would really be happy. So it's very, very hard to fulfill this teaching. But now let me tell you what's sad. As a rabbi, I often am exposed in dealing with people to whom terrible tragedies have occurred. It could be a death. It could be a very bad injury that's been sustained, an illness from which there's not going to be a recovery. In other words, it's losses that are more in the realm of the irrevocable. And a sad thing that sometimes happens is people will say to me, or poignant, will say to me, Rabbi, if things could only go back to being the way they used to be, I would be so happy. But I knew those people when things were the way they were used to be, and they weren't happy. So what's tragic is there are people who can only experience what happiness is when they no longer have it. But the world often will break our hearts. And therefore, if we can't learn to appreciate happiness while we're having it, we're never going to be happy. So that's why this teaching is one we have to struggle with every day of our lives. I am not in any way minimizing it. I'm not just throwing it out as if it's something easy. Oh, you want to be rich? Be happy with what you have. It is something we have to struggle with. What, after all, is probably the most famous inspirational movie ever made. It's A Wonderful Life, in which a man really wants to die because of terrible things that have happened to him, and we can all empathize with why the character of George Bailey wants to commit suicide. But when he finally comes to realize the good that he has done in his life, and that it's permeated the lives of so many others, and the love that people experience from him, he's very willing to absorb those other losses, because he realizes that the life that he has dismissed as a failed life has really in many, many ways been a wonderful life. We have to have that perspective. That's what will help bring us to a feeling of who is rich, one who is happy with what he or she has.
I think this is a moment that we can step back and we can take stock of our lives, and we can say, well, what would it really take for me to be a success in my life, and start to craft our lives around that.
When we experience a material loss, it's very, very important to ask specific questions. What exactly have I lost? What of the material is absolutely necessary? And what is it that became a luxury that turned into a necessity?
Who is rich? Hasameach bechelko, one who is happy with what he or she has. It is very hard for most of us to practice that teaching, because most of us have a tendency to think, if I only had this, I'd be happier.
And so even though we feel like our world is moving incredibly fast, and even though we feel like everything's urgent, it's helpful to look back and to say, well, we're actually part of a bigger picture, and to think about where we want to be in that bigger picture.
To be a believer must mean to be an optimist. Otherwise, one is saying this world is out of control, this world is meaningless, there is no guide.
We have the possibility right now of reimagining what we want both our country and our world to look like, and to start to create that, and to know that it's not going to be done by the time any of us finish our work here. It just won't. And yet we have to feel like we're moving towards something. Otherwise, it's hard to get up in the morning if you don't feel like there's something that you're working toward that will be better than what's been.